Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI Radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. My guest today is Jon Marvel. Jon Marvel is the founder of Western Watersheds Project, whose focus is to end livestock grazing on public lands. Since 1997, this conservation organization has over 70,000 members and supporters and 18 employees in 9 Western states. In 2014, Jon retired as the executive director and continues his work as vice president of the Sagebrush Habitat Conservation Fund, which seeks to permanently retire federal livestock grazing permits. Originally from Delaware, Jon has lived in Idaho for 57 years, where he enjoys wilderness river running and hiking the roadless areas of Idaho. Welcome, Jon.
Thanks, Glenn. Happy to be here.
Would you like to make introductory comments?
No, you can just go ahead with your questions.
So, very good. Question 1. Why have you made the elimination of livestock grazing from public lands the focus of your environmental work?
Well, it's because public lands ranching and livestock grazing is the single largest negative impact on public land ecosystems in the American West. It's underreported, and it's afflicted by multiple political pressures, especially because ranchers are very powerful, influential in the political arena, and have been for decades. I think that's beginning to fade a little. But the ecological impacts of ranching are greater than any other extractive use on public lands.
For more than 30 years, you have argued for and actively participated in the strategy that environmentalists should enter the market, purchase grazing leases, and then voluntarily retire them from use. Is this strategy working?
It is working, but it's on a fairly slow pace, slower than I would like to see. And the main reason is that we face political problems. Ranching is deeply embedded in the psyches of Americans and politicians as important, even though economically it's not important. The only reason it's important is because of the damage it does. So we have some political blocks to our activities that continue, although it depends mostly on the administration in power in Washington, because that can change drastically from one administration to another, as we've recently seen.
Since the majority of grazing permits are held by corporations and millionaire hobby ranchers who live somewhere else, would you be in favor of terminating these privileges for all or some of these leaseholders? Jonathan Radner told me that this can be legally done tomorrow.
Well, legally and politically possible are two different things. Of course, I'd like to see strong action taken by the land management agencies, including the BLM, the Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, even the U.S. military in some cases, and the National Park Service. All these agencies have numerous powers to administer these lands for the better, but they choose not to. So I don't think that's going to be happening anytime very soon. Also, I'd just like to correct one small thing. You said that the majority of the permits are held by rich people. It's actually a majority, well over a majority of the permitted AUMs, which are the use of one cow and one calf for a month. And that is true, but the permits probably are spread out more widely since many of the permittees have very small permits.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Should individuals and organizations who have a vested economic interest in using public lands for profit be part of the decision-making process for determining what happens on public lands?
Well, probably not, because they've been such bad actors for so long. But at the same time, if we're going to be a democracy, we have to include Americans and their ability to comment on public actions by the government, an idea that was strong for many decades and seems to have disappeared under the current administration. So I'm in favor of public comment by anybody. That's not to say I support kowtowing, literally, to lick the boots of ranchers in the future.
Mm-hmm. George Werthner suggested, when I interviewed him a few months ago, that if all livestock grazing leases were retired immediately, family ranchers who actually live off the public land should be allowed to sustain their lifestyle until they die. Then these leases should be retired. What do you think of this idea?
Well, I think that's a very generous idea, but we need to keep in mind that and be honest and transparent about the costs of doing such a thing, because we've seen that even where retirements have occurred, literally, but extended periods of use, usually for a descendant of the current permittee, that there's been political shenanigans to prevent the actual retirement from ever taking place. So we have to be cautious about that, but I don't think it's a bad idea. I just think it needs to be explained. And we have purportedly in the U.S. Equal protection under the law, so I don't think you could do that just for a certain percentage of permittees on public lands. You would have to do it for all.
Mm-hmm. What is your long-range goal for our public lands? Do you think they should eventually become designated wilderness?
Well, that might be an ideal outcome, but let's face it, the lands we're talking about are often heavily roaded and also have other extractive uses taking place on them, like mining, for example, and logging in the national forests. And there's many negative aspects to industrial recreation, also both motorized and non-motorized, that would not be addressed by retiring grazing permits. So problems would still occur, but the largest negative impact of all would be alleviated.
Have you thought about how much of the land surface of the earth, or perhaps the lower 48 states, should be wilderness in the spirit of the 1964 Wilderness Act?
Well, I'm strongly in favor of additional designated wilderness everywhere, and also big projects like the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which seeks to tie together public lands and designate them as wilderness over 4 states. These projects have limited political futures at the moment and have not been successful over time. But that doesn't mean we can't be optimistic about it. I am optimistic about it. But we have a very bad political background happening right now. And in fact, many of the protections for public lands are being renegotiated or eliminated as we speak.
You have said, quote, "North America is the only place in the world where we have a chance to restore natural functions and all the species that were present." End quote. What an inspiring observation. With regard to public lands, what are some of the big changes, in addition to ending livestock grazing, that must take place to accomplish this goal of rewilding North America?
Well, the key elements are eliminating livestock, eliminating logging on public lands would be helpful, eliminating other manipulations of the landscape as currently being carried out by the Forest Service and the BLM, like juniper removal or even prescribed fire, I would eliminate too. And if you got rid of those plus mining on public lands, you would effectively be returning the landscape to a former, better condition. Road closures would be essential as well. As you know, places like the Coast Range in Oregon and Washington have more miles of roadway per acre than any urban area in the United States, all because of industrial logging. That could be stopped, and the land would recover better.
Any thoughts about rewilding the eastern United States, where there is much less public land?
Well, I am also in favor of rewilding in the east. The dilemma, as you mentioned, is the huge private land ownerships in most of the east. But there's still huge areas in northern New England and part of the Appalachians that could be put into wilderness category and protected in that way, and yet help recover native species, including fish and insects and lizards and snakes, all of which have suffered by the fragmentation of habitat that's occurred.
What about using the right of eminent domain to create national parks and wilderness areas for the sake of biodiversity and life on Earth? I believe that was done in the case of Shenandoah National Park and the Great Smokies Mountains National Park.
Yes, that's correct. The U.S. has used eminent domain to acquire lands, and I think that's politically infeasible at this time. One hopes in the future that buyouts and the public acquisition of these lands wouldn't be possible. I would look forward to that day.
Given the fact of regulatory capture of our state and federal land management agencies, what is the point of dialoguing with agency people? Is there a benefit to it?
No, it causes psychological distress.
I get it.
So the benefit is only that you're letting people who ostensibly have some authority in managing public lands know that there are other points of view and values which they're ignoring. And I think that is important to do. And I also think it's important to keep a stick handy, and that's in the form of legal actions to benefit wildlife, all life, and the ecological health of the landscape at the same time. Because as a few things that the land management agencies are afraid of. One is litigation, the other is legislation, and both would be important to complete to make things better.
The present executive director of Western Watersheds Project, Eric Mulvare, as you know, recently posted an excellent essay in the Wildlife News, arguing that the public lands ranching industry and their lobbyists are extremists who have opposed and will continue to oppose all reasonable changes to improve the health of public lands. For this reason, I know that you prefer court to collaboration, but you also say, and I quote you here, by itself, litigation cannot achieve the needed changes, end quote. What else is required beyond lawsuits?
Well, I think I mentioned the word already. It's legislation. We need to expand protected areas at the national level and also in states that have a political value system that's conducive to protecting wildlife habitat and ecological health. So legislation is the other key item. Other than that, we need to convince our peers in the citizenry that protecting public lands is a critical part of their lives, too. And I think that can be done. But the role I've chosen over the years involves confronting the mistakes of the current time and the past directly. And we can only do that through litigation or legislation. Collaboration is not a good outcome of resolving these problems, in my judgment.
I know that you and the Western Watersheds Project place a lot of emphasis on education. Of course, education is a broad word. Could you elaborate on this a bit?
Well, education is used to cover everything that's imparted to others. And what we need is stronger natural science education in elementary and high schools across the country. And also we need to have children especially spend more time outdoors. Those things are critically important. Mm-hmm. But that's not the role that our group has chosen.
Mm-hmm. I know that in your younger days, going back to 1966, you co-founded the organization We Won't Go in response to the Vietnam War draft. When you describe the livestock industry as, and I quote, a culture of death that creates biological deserts in areas that should be exuberant with life, end quote, are you intending to connect the military-industrial complex to the assault on the earth?
Well, I think it's inevitable to come in and propose that capitalism itself and all the military or fire industrial complexes or other industrial complexes that have negative impacts on that have to be brought to heel. And that's going to be hard to do. I think that retiring federal grazing permits may be a more modest goal and has been accomplished and continues to be accomplished, although not at the rate I would like to see.
Mm-hmm. Are property rights in America too strong in the sense that they block the common good?
Well, that's a tough question to answer, and I don't think it's particularly germane. I think that it is a problem in some arenas, And I think in other arenas, it is important that we've established under our Constitution property rights, because the government is not always trustworthy. And as a consequence, even if private property use may seem problematic, the government owning everything is also problematic.
Mm-hmm. Do you think ranchers should be financially compensated for depredation by wolves, for example, on public lands?
No, I don't. I think that that's an absurd waste of money, because it doesn't change their attitude. It just encourages them to behave in the same way more readily in the hope of getting funding.
And I agree with you about what you said about not compensating the depredation on public lands. So I think I know how you're going to answer this next question, but I'll ask it anyhow.
Okay.
Do you think that range riding programs are a waste of taxpayers' money?
Yes, of course they are. And it's just another way to subsidize ranching on public lands. Someone else gets paid to do something ranchers can't take care of themselves or don't want to, and expect to be compensated in one way or another indefinitely for everything that goes wrong for them, whether it's something as simple as the weather, a lack of moisture, drought, and, of course, wild animals, which, of course, want to eat their livestock, and who can blame them?
Once again, I agree 100%. If all livestock leases on public lands were terminated tomorrow, as the law permits, do you think family ranchers who depend on ranching for their livelihood should be assisted by society and the federal government in some special way?
Well, I've always supported the Public Lands Grazing Retirement Act, which has had different names over the years, which would use the federal treasury to buy out federal grazing permits from when voluntarily proffered for permanent retirement. I think that would accomplish this much more quickly, this necessary outcome. And the Sagebrush Fund, of which I'm one of the board members, has been doing that. We've been paying ranchers to get out of ranching. It's not, as some of my colleagues have said, it is just money. And while it is just money, if they're actually gone after you've paid it, that's a good outcome.
I think that's a great idea of using the federal treasury to accomplish the task.
Well, Glenn, let me expand that a little bit more for your listeners. For probably $3 to $4 billion, or a basic rounding error in the military budget, we could buy out all ranchers tomorrow.
What do you think of ballot initiatives and measures with regard to the management of public lands?
Well, at the federal level, there really is no way to do that. It does exist at the state level, and a number of initiatives have been passed in Oregon and California, for example, and also to prevent, for example, the killing of predators like mountain lions, and also to prevent trapping, as in Colorado. I think those are good in arenas which are controlled by the state, like hunting, fishing, and trapping. But we can't control through state actions, through an initiative petition, the management of federal public lands.
Right.
It's a much larger issue.
So you probably know that people such as Noam Chomsky, Ralph Nader, Howard Zinn, and many others have tried to enact into law a way to petition at the federal level. Do you think that's a good strategy to pursue?
Well, I'd say the chances are slim that would happen because it would require probably a change to the Constitution. It's really much better just to elect people who do what you want, and we could do that and have done that in the past. And so I don't consider it to be impossible, especially when it comes to ecological health of the landscape and protecting values related to wildlife, wilderness, backcountry recreation, and ending extractive uses, because one of the great champions of all of those things was the senator from my state, Frank Church. And he accomplished perhaps as much as anybody in terms of the Wilderness Act and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And, of course, he supported the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Endangered Species Act. So that's quite a list of accomplishments.
For sure. Trump recently visited China, and I heard that there is a $1 trillion business deal being discussed in which China could once again buy American land. How do you feel about foreign countries, not just China, buying land in America?
Oh, I'm completely opposed to it, and I hope that stops immediately.
Do you think there should be logging, mining, oil and gas development on public lands at all?
Well, as you know, I've chosen to operate mostly in a particular realm of public land usage, and that's one of the least understood by most Americans, and that is public lands ranching, which is, as we've discussed, a welfare condition. In other words, a tax on the American people to keep it going. I'm also in favor of eliminating all logging on public lands, since most logging that provides construction material occurs in the U.S. South on completely altered private lands. And that logging should stop also. Of course, we should stop using all petroleum products too, Glenn, by the way. And so ultimately we need to phase out oil and gas and other petroleum extractive uses on public lands or in the sea. Getting to those points is going to be challenging when we're now instructed to use more gas and less clean energy with our current administration. It's all moving backwards.
I agree with you about how bad livestock grazing is in the arid West. But I lived in California for 20 years, and I also saw horrific damage to the forests of California and Oregon due to logging. Do you think the environmental conservation community should form an umbrella organization that would seek, at a minimum, the end of all extractive activities on public lands? Or would this weaken the force and focus of organizations such as the Western Watersheds Project?
Well, I think it would undermine the efforts of those of us who work on lesser-known problems on public lands. As you know, there are many, many groups addressing the problems with logging on public lands. There's very few addressing public lands ranching. You know, but people in California may not understand that there are cows up in the golden trout wilderness in the Sierra Nevada mountains, making a hash of things at elevation. And yet, you show anybody a picture of a clear cut, and they understand that this is like raping the landscape.
Yes, that's very true. How do you feel about livestock grazing on private lands?
Well, I think we should all stop eating beef immediately. That's my perspective, and I haven't eaten any beef for 37 or 8 years now, and I don't intend to start, unlike Bobby Kennedy, for example. Mm-hmm. And so I think that diet should be taken seriously as an ecological impact zone of interest. Mm-hmm. And removing beef and other deleterious agricultural production like alfalfa hay is critically important too. But I've not chosen to work on private land issues because nobody was working on public land issues to do with livestock grazing for so long, and it deserves more attention by everybody. And so if we were to remove public lands ranching, then we can address private lands ranching.
Mm-hmm. Now that makes sense. You were trained as an architect before becoming a full-time conservation activist. How does that background shape the way you see landscapes and the human place on this planet?
Well, in several ways, and incidentally, I'm still a licensed architect and have been for almost 50 years now. And while I don't do very much practicing of that, I maintain my license through online continuing education. So I'm proud of that. But architecture is an important understanding of the landscape and how people live in it. And it involves many, many important environmental issues like use of materials, like insulation and preventing heat loss, in using landscapes in ways that don't degrade the appearance of the landscape and reduce the profile of the developments. I also support what Oregon has done with urban growth boundaries, which is an important part of understanding that people don't need to occupy very much of the landscape. Urban areas provide a lot of benefits for people, and they can be improved within and densified within a boundary that reduces the impacts outside the boundary. Mm-hmm. So all those things are part of architecture, too.
Would you say that beauty and form are as important as ecological function?
Sure. I wouldn't have gotten into architecture in the first place if I didn't think it had to reflect those values in particular.
Many people look at our public lands and they do not see the harm that has taken place from livestock grazing, as you have already mentioned. Aldo Leopold said that ecological change requires a change in perception. Any thoughts about how this shift in perception could come about in the American psyche?
Well, it is a tough question, and most people are more interested in how their streaming service is working than in the condition of public lands, and I get that. Not that I think it's such a great outcome. But at the same time, there are many examples of the recovery of public lands when livestock are removed that can be brought to people's attention and really need to be more. For example, there's almost 1 million acres in Oregon and northwest Nevada in Hart Mountain and Charles Sheldon National Wildlife Refuges that have not had livestock there for more than 35 years now. And the changes are dramatic and self-evident to anybody who goes there and compares the landscape in between them at Beatty's Butte, for example. And so these things can be brought to the attention of the public, those with an open mind. And right here in central Idaho, where I am now, we have tremendous riparian recovery on areas where cattle have been removed for decades in some cases. And we now have one ranger district on the Boise National Forest that has no livestock grazing permits whatsoever. And those changes can be shown to people, and in a different Forest Service or other land management scenario, which I would support, like enabling conservation as the main use and governing all other choices, we could have more areas like that would show people that there's better wildlife, cleaner water, fisheries are healthier, all kinds of benefits occur that are not immediately apparent to most people.
Mm-hmm. How important are the numerous wildlife documentaries that are now flooding YouTube?
Well, I don't watch video on YouTube, so I don't know what they are. But at the same time, I know that traditionally on public television, for example, nature programs have not addressed damage caused by human behavior. And it's only recently that such famous people as David Attenborough, who recently turned 100 years old, started to talk about the damaging effects of, for example, trawling, seafloor trawling across the planet, destroying the ecosystem of the ocean. And he's a person who has tremendous impact because, as I understand it, he's regarded as the single highest rated individual by all people in the British Isles. So that means his influence is dramatic. And so when he says trawling needs to stop, even the government starts to think about it.
Mm-hmm. After decades of struggle in the conservation arena, what have you learned about what motivates human beings?
It varies quite a lot, Glenn, as I'm sure you know. I mean, there are a lot of people who are happy if they make enough money to live on somehow. And other thoughts about the impacts of what they're doing on the world at large may not occur to them. And especially if people don't have much, I understand completely. But at the same time, we live in the world and we're going to die depending on if the world lets us live or not. And we seem to have chosen maybe a suicidal path here, that the earth will shrug us off and go on for millions of more years, won't it? But we might not be here as a population.
You have been harshly criticized, not only by ranchers and beef industry lobbyists, but also by many mainstream environmentalists. What effect has this had on you?
Well, essentially none. In doing this kind of work, you have to develop a kind of thick skin because the status quo is very powerful, and many people working in conservation believe that collaborating with their opponents is the only solution to problems, when in fact, typically they are rolling over and being crushed like a bug on the windshield. Mm-hmm. And so if we don't stand up for our principles, which are generally favorable to all human beings and all life on Earth, I would say we're failing to do our job.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. This next question is give you a chance to perhaps elaborate on what you just said. What is your advice to young environmentalists who may be hesitant to advocate for big changes at a time when small victories seems to be the aim of the big green groups?
Well, I, like many people, have lost a lot of faith in the big green groups because they've chosen to enhance their self-importance by being essentially sycophants of the political order of the day. And that's a real shame because many of them have many members who they treat poorly, I think. And yet we know that change can happen, and I would encourage any young people to think of any situation that they've discovered out in their trips into wildlands or even semi-wild lands that has bothered them and speak up about it. Because unless we all speak up as much as we can, and not everybody can, we're not going to make progress in the difficult environment of, shall we say, capitalism and patriarchy and all the negative impacts of many centuries of colonialism can't be shrugged off all at once, can they?
Most people want to get along and be liked, even by their enemies. What is the secret, virtue, or quality that enables some people to speak truth to power regardless of social consequences? Is it conscience, courage, or what?
Well, I think it's all of the above. But maybe it's a touch of madness, too. Who knows?
You could be right. I'm sure you agree that saving public lands requires not only overcoming selfish and greedy economic interests, but cultural forces as well, such as cowboy mythology. Would you say something about this powerful myth?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The cowboy mythology, I'm happy to say, has really disintegrated in lots of ways over the last 45 years or so. Before that, it was such a ubiquitous part of television and the movies that people grew up believing that cowboys were saintly and wonderful and always killed a bad guy. But that was such a simplification of reality, and there are some films that have been made that undermine that. But for the most part, those Hollywood and national TV shows that we're all familiar with, at least if you're over a certain age, are fading into the past. And now I think is a much easier time to convince people that corporate ranching is a big problem because corporate greed is affecting them in lots of different ways that are negative. And so I'm kind of a outspoken optimist about this and don't really regard the cowboy myth as a dispositive cultural entity anymore. It's almost like a joke. And when I see in an airport 1 out of 1,000 people in a cowboy outfit, I think, oh, look, a clown show.
Mm-hmm.
And and that's the way it should be considered. Mm-hmm. And also I'd mention one other thing, that you know how many movies John Wayne appeared in, cowboy movies, that is.
100, maybe?
Well, easily, I'd say. And, you know, he was the epitome of all that cowboy myth. But, you know, they never showed John Wayne as a sheep herder, did they?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so all of the cowboy myth does not apply to the grazing of domestic sheep on public lands, which are actually easier because of that reality to end than cattle grazing.
So there are other cultural influences, such as TV commercials that promote motorized recreation that devastate public lands. I know we can't go into the controversial topic of free speech within the time we have, but it's outrageous that corporations, Jeep, for example, encourage people to speed through streams, drive pickup trucks to the tops of mountains and that sort of thing. Should this kind of advertisement be permitted in America or anywhere?
No, not in my opinion. No, it's very destructive to encourage people to damage the environment in that way or any way.
Right, so you're not an absolutist then when it comes to the principle of freedom of speech.
No, look what it's gotten us.
Yeah.
When the Supreme Court says that money is free speech and therefore the rich can control politics, I think we've really slipped badly in terms of a democratic nation.
Now, I agree with you again, but I'm afraid we're in a very small minority there. You point out that less than 3% of the national beef supply comes from public lands ranching. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of profit there. Why do millionaires and corporations covet livestock leases?
Well, there's some of the status involved in the cowboy myth where you can claim to be a cattle baron, or in the case of someone like Ted Turner, a bison baron. And it's always been regarded, if you're a large landowner in the rugged West, that you're important. And so people want that, especially when they make a lot of money doing something else. And they often buy ranches because of the scenery and maybe the water rushing by or the giant lodge that they get. But in fact, many other ranchers and corporate interests buy ranches in order to get depreciable assets and to diminish their income tax in other lines of work. And ranches offer that because you can depreciate every mile of fence, every mile of road, every cattle guard, every stock pond, everything that's been done on this property by somebody else before you that you didn't even do. Because you're a new owner, you can depreciate that. And that's a big problem. And also, they get diminished property taxes, they get county services, they get wildlife services killing predators. It's all a big game. And now they get drought insurance that's subsidized by the government. And many ranchers in the arid West are making more money from their drought insurance than from raising cattle.
Yeah, well, thanks for that comprehensive answer. Are they all also making big profits from selling this beef to Japan, Mexico, China, and other places?
Well, I doubt it. The public lands ranching production of beef is such a small percentage of the total in the country that it's virtually immaterial, economically speaking. And there's only a few large operators who have vertically integrated business models where they own the cattle, they have huge public land permits, plus they have their own slaughterhouse and their own packing plants, and they actually make money. But most ranchers get by on almost nothing. If they can buy a new Dodge pickup truck every 6 years, they're feeling pretty puffed up, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that in Idaho, the J.R. Simplot Company holds extremely large federal grazing allotments.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that a bidding war with them is very expensive. Is one purpose of the Sagebrush Habitat Conservation Fund to raise money from environmentally friendly people to enable competitive bidding with such large corporate entities?
Well, remember that we can't compete for leases on federal public lands at all. I started the Western Watersheds back in the 90s in order to compete for leases on state of Idaho public school endowment land where you can compete against them. We competed against Simplot quite a few times and won some leases from Simplot. But it's not a good solution ultimately because the much larger areas that they're leasing are federal public land, not subject to requirements, constitutional requirements, to raise money for school children.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I read about that. In preparation for this interview, I did a little research here where I live in Grand Junction, Colorado, and I found that there's a place for sale. It's called the Bugling Elk Ranch. It's not too far outside of Grand Junction. It's 2,100 acres with a BLM grazing allotment permit tied to the deeded acreage. What does that mean?
Well, the private property was privatized usually in the central western states by homesteaders back in the 1800s and early 1900s. And that's how that 2,000 acres was acquired and taken out of the public realm. The grazing permit under the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 is tied to what's called a base property, which is owned by somebody, a rancher, or it could be a media tycoon or a tech tycoon nowadays. And so the permit for that BLM land is transferred with the private ranch holdings. It's not separated out, and it's routine for those transfers. The BLM could choose not to transfer it, but they never do, because the tradition is that it's attached to that base property.
Mm-hmm. So the asking price is $5.5 million. Very roughly speaking, how much value does this allotment add to the value of this ranch and property?
Well, it depends on how many cows you can put out there. If it's a huge acreage, we know ranches in Nevada, for example, that might be 200 or 300 acres of private land, but have permits to 600,000 or 800,000 acres of federal public land. And so in cases like that, the public land can be extremely important, and in some cases provide even year-round grazing for pennies on the dollar. As you know, the federal grazing fee is heavily subsidized, and it's about 20 times less than what is charged by private parties to each other.
Right. So this property also has water rights. And so the leases, as was explained to me, are privileges. But the water is a right. So what can be done to override or minimize these water rights held oftentimes by millionaires and corporations.
Well, and they often are, that's correct. But your state of Colorado or my state of Idaho could change the way they administer water rights. A water right is a property right like land ownership property, but the state owns the water. The water right only gives a right to use a certain amount of water, to divert it in a certain place, and to spread it out in another place over time. And typically water rights in the arid West are not year-round. They run from, say, March to October or April to November. And so it's a use right. You can use the water for irrigating, say, during that time period, but the state still owns the water. That's Western water law. And what the states could do to make things more appropriate, in my judgment, is to start charging for the use of the water. Now they don't charge anything.
Yes, I read that. I read what you said on that. Mm-hmm.
And so if the rancher belongs to an irrigation district that has a canal off some big river or reservoir, the canal company can charge, or the irrigation district, the property owner a certain amount per acre foot of water delivered. But none of that money goes to the real owner of the water, which is the state. And that's just been the practice from the start. Give away the water right for it. But the states could change that legislatively, mm-hmm. and charge people a reasonable sum to encourage water conservation and to eliminate uses that are uneconomic, of which there are many.
Mm-hmm. So I ask all my guests this question in one or two sentences. Why wilderness?
Well, I think Howard Zahniser, the creator of the Wilderness Act, maybe said it best that there's no point in living on the earth, and I'm paraphrasing here, unless we have full access to experience wilderness, because wilderness is rejuvenating and enables us to understand our place in ways that nothing else can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Is there anything we can learn from socialism?
Of course, socialism can be a hugely helpful method of allocating public benefits. I think the most obvious example of where socialism makes sense is in medical insurance, because every single person is subject to medical risk, no matter how rich or poor they are. And that risk can be very, very difficult to overcome and may subject people to suffering for a long period of time that can be partially or wholly alleviated by allopathic medicine. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, medical achievements should not be limited, in my judgment, to just those who can pay for them, whether with their money and their insurance or just their money, and leaving people who can't afford it out in the cold. Mm-hmm. So that's where socialism can provide an answer, as many European countries have shown us.
I agree. Could the present drought foretell the end of public land ranching in the West?
I would say yes, especially if it gets bad enough. But remember, it may not eliminate ranchers as an economically special group because they may be paid off by the government anyway just to keep wearing their clothing and driving their pickup truck.
Mm-hmm.
And so is that the end of public lands ranching? Well, in a way. And then they become even more cartoonish, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Could grave economic problems in America end subsidizing industries such as livestock, grazing, and timber extraction on public lands?
Well, yes, of course. Any scrutiny provided on the federal budget and state budgets, too, in regard to subsidizing extractive uses, should happen under economic stress, and in many places will happen. We just can't tell to what extent, because the focus of government, if there's a collapse economically, will be under extreme duress to do much of anything.
Mm-hmm. You used the term shocking experience in one of your interviews, and I'm trying to get a hold on what you mean by that. You talk about it in the context of bringing about real change in our society, and I'm wondering if a severe economic collapse in America might be the kind of shocking experience that could actually bring forth some, a qualitatively better lifestyle.
Well, I would say yes, it could, but we'd be speculating because we don't know why it's happening or is going to happen, or how fragmented the public systems to deal with that will be at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would hesitate to say that it could be a solution to extractive uses on public lands without probably going through the experience. And then I could give you a definitive view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Well, that's fair enough. If a person is not willing to use his or her education and experience to help stop the sixth extinction, then should this person be drawing a federal average salary of $80,000 a year by working for a land management agency?
Well, I think this takes us into the realm of human resource management.
Mm-hmm.
And how you pick your staffing for land management agencies. And I think to date, the most people working for the agencies addressing public lands management are graduates of land-grant universities. And therefore, they're pretty heavily brainwashed. And it's not surprising that they are not terribly sympathetic to some of the values you and I may hold.
Mm-hmm. Would you accept the term welfare scientists for people who are living off taxpayer money without doing their jobs to sustain biodiversity?
Well, you would be describing a lot of people, I think. And anytime you threaten people's jobs, they are going to cause trouble for you. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure it's an excellent choice to spend your time on punishing ersatz scientists.
Mm-hmm. So the Colorado Parks and Wildlife staff recently recommended against a citizen petition to ban the commercial sales of wild fur bearer pelts in Colorado. It's clear that these state land management employees face an agency culture entailing pressure from their supervisors. But they do have First Amendment rights. So how are we to assess and evaluate such anti-nature decisions by the staff?
Well, I think it's difficult because they want to keep their job, and you don't know what's happening behind the scenes in that agency. And it may be coercive, it may be destructive of families, or maybe threatening, who knows. Mm-hmm. But in any case, the more transparency there is on decision-making means the less political machinations can get in the way of actual science.
So I'm sure, I think you would agree, that these people are very intelligent. Their scientific knowledge certainly exceeds my own. So the main problem seems to be that the higher up you go in the agency, the less concerned they are about biodiversity, and the more pressure, intimidation tactics, fear of losing your job, and so on, they put on the knowledgeable staff that works for them. Would you agree with that?
I think that coincides with my experience here in Idaho, especially with the Idaho Fish and Game Department. It's dominated by non-conservation interests.
Mm-hmm. Is your underlying belief that fundamentally changing how we relate to public land is a path to a new American culture and lifestyle?
Well, I'd like to believe that, but I have a far more modest goal at this point, and that is to end public lands ranching. Mm-hmm. Because if we accomplish that, people would have a very different experience of their public lands. I, of course, wouldn't want to end logging on public lands and the impacts of mining, but what I know best is public lands ranching. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I focus on.
So judging by the results of Proposition 127 in Colorado, which was an attempt to ban the trophy hunting of mountain lions, it seems that the public, it failed to do so. It seems like the public still thinks that state and federal land managing agencies are doing good science. Can the development of an environmental ethic within the population offset this or overcome this?
Yeah, I think so. Because hunting, fishing, and trapping are diminishing activities. And they're primarily male in use anyway. Mm-hmm. And the people who do those things, trapping, especially in most of the West, is a negligible activity anyway. And the hunting and fishing and guiding by outfitters has some aspects of conservation associated with it and the North American model for wildlife management. Mm-hmm. But that's an obsolete form in my judgment because it fails to address conservation of all species and the importance of habitat. And over the decades, there's been more effort put into many states on habitat for non-native pheasants than for any native wildlife. And that's a crazy idea, just so you can go out in a cornfield and blow pheasants apart. Mm-hmm. That's not conservation management.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have about 7 or 8 questions left, so I just want to thank you for hanging in there and answering these questions. how do you feel about electoral politics as a vehicle for real change?
Well, as you know, I've been involved in the Democratic Party here in Idaho. And so at one time in the past, the Democrats were an equal force in the state legislature, and we elected many Democratic governors and congressmen over the years. And that's all faded away as the super conservative Republican wing has taken over and continues to expand its deleterious impacts. So I think politics can be very helpful given the right circumstances and the right people in office, and should be encouraged. I always encourage people to participate in local politics and maybe higher politics if they have the stomach for it.
What is your personal antidote for dealing with the growing ecological crisis?
Well, I do drink whiskey, if that's what you mean.
Yeah. Anything else?
Not really. I say that in a good-humored way, but
Yeah.
It's true that I do feel pretty good after a shot of whiskey or a glass of wine, and so I'm not in favor of a new era of prohibition.
Okay, I'll try more of that myself. How would you explain the weak resistance and rebellion over what's happening to the earth, especially among young people?
Well, I can't explain it. I think there's a great deal of lack of knowledge and understanding about the importance of natural systems to the survival of the human race. And yet, maybe that's changing a little bit as we go on here. I did appreciate the attitude of the Artemis II astronauts as they circled the moon and sent us back some quite wonderful photos of the Earth in space. And of course, when I was in college, we saw the first photos from space of the Earth, and that had a big impact on me and many other people, because you can't see one of those photographs without understanding that this is an island in space. And all island ecologies are dependent on natural processes that, if interrupted or destroyed, can result in the extinction of that activity altogether. And so, that gave me a little hope that people would not only see the photos the Artemis astronauts took, but also listen to what they said about seeing the Earth from 200,000 miles away.
I agree with you. As an architect, you must be repulsed by the huge homes that affluent Americans are building, especially around scenic landscapes. I see it as a form of gluttony. I read that you always only wanted to design smaller homes, and now you're focused on more fire-resistant homes?
Well, yes, that's true. But also, right from the start of my design period, I was very involved in a graduate school learning about energy conservation. That was at a period of time during the mid-70s, when we had oil shocks. And as a consequence, conserving energy became very important for me, as I understood our dependence as a civilization on petroleum products was a mistake. And so I've always designed structures to be as energy efficient and non-consuming of resources as possible.
Mm-hmm. When you started WWP, Western Watersheds Project, for the sake of our listeners, I know you thought it would have a finite existence?
Yeah, it was a project.
Right. Do you plan to hang in there as long as you possibly can?
Well, who knows how much longer I have. I'll be 80 next year. Mm-hmm. So that's not so young anymore. And I'm healthy now, but, when you get to a certain age, you realize that everything can change very quickly in regard to your health. So I'll continue to do what I can, and probably not as much, but I think that I've set in motion other people who have terrific skills and aptitudes and understandings, and they'll continue.
And the final question, I know your goal when you started was to eliminate all livestock grazing on public lands. Do you still believe this goal can be accomplished in your lifetime?
Oh, well, I'm not sure about that, because it seems unlikely at this point. But at the same time, it's kind of a dead-end occupation and business, ranching on public lands. It's immaterial and almost immeasurable, economically speaking. Plus, it's highly destructive, as we've discussed. And there's no need for it. And as ranchers get old and die off, even if they're not bought out, I think it will go away of its own accord. But it won't be as quick as I'd like.
And the second part of my last question, this long-range goal of eliminating all livestock grazing from public lands, what does it depend on the most?
Oh, I think a shift in consciousness about the importance of ecological health and biodiversity. I think that would take care of it in a jiffy. And also some honesty on the part of fiscal conservatives about throwing money away on nothing in Congress. And they should be held accountable by their electorate.
Thank you, Jon, for doing this interview and for your long service on behalf of America's wildlife and wildlands. Thank you for recognizing, as a very young person, that the real fight is the fight for the earth and not to fight for the imperial wars of the super rich.
Well, thank you, Glenn. I appreciate talking with you.
So thank you. You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations with my guest, Jon Marvel, on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversation in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then please send me an email, wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org.